human beings have been very, very we're good at talking about ourselves, but actually we need to be better at telling stories about the other lives with which we share our planet, because we are crew. We are the crew. We are the ones who are currently trying to steer and drive, but actually we need to really, really pay attention to the stories of the other organisms that are down in the engine room and in the passenger seats, and tell their stories too.
You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast with me, Dan Burgess.
Hello, welcome to the show. Thanks for tuning in. This is Dan. This is episode 42, and in this episode I'm in conversation with writer, author and activist Nicola Davies. Now, I had the amazing opportunity to work with Nicola last year on the launch of an animation, an adaptation of her incredible book, The Promise, along with a schools and community screening campaign, which I did through my work with Wild Labs and the Wild Network. Now, Nicola trained as a zoologist and became a children's author, a prolific author. She's written, I actually can't remember, but we talk about this in the show, but just an enormous amount of books that she's published. Many of them exploring our connection to the natural world, to the more than human world, and also exploring environmental and social issues through her work. Back in the day, if you were a child of you grew up in the 80s, or I was born in the 70s, but grew up in the 80s. Nicola, you might know Nicola. She was a co-presenter of the kids' TV show, The Really Wild Show. And she's also been a creative writer, lecturer. She continues to work also with young people with creative writing and exploring kind of activism and nature connection and issues through writing. So if you have kids, or actually even if you don't have kids, check out Nicola's books. They really are extraordinary. I'll link to stuff in the show notes. So yeah, it was really, Nicola has this amazing energy. She's just someone I could listen to for hours, to be honest. So it was such a treat to have this conversation. I'm going to cut straight to it. This is episode 42 of the Spaceship Earth podcast with writer and activist Nicola Davies. Right, Nicola, welcome to the Spaceship Earth podcast.
Lovely to be here.
Yeah, great to get the time to have a chat. And whereabouts are you on the Spaceship Earth right now? Just because everyone's all over the place these days.
I'm at my desk, which is in the corner of our big open plan living space, because I live in a converted chapel in West Wales, in Pembrokeshire. So if I stepped outside my kitchen door now, I could see the sea, and in the morning I can see the island of Grassholm, because it catches the light when the sun comes up.
Beautiful. And because you've moved there, is it quite recently? Yeah,
we actually managed to move in the middle of lockdown,
right?
But I moved from the Brecon Beacons, so I've been in Wales, which is actually my country. My family, my ancestors are all Welsh.
Yeah,
I come from a long line of miners and steel workers on the Gower. So I'd been living in Wales for sort of 10 years before I finally moved down to Pembrokeshire in May this year.
Amazing. And so we connected this year through the Promise, through your book, The Promise, and the animation, which is just released a week ago.
All very exciting. Very exciting.
And all kinds of stuff's emerging through that, which is great, and we'll dig into that. But it's funny, as I was just sort of thinking about this conversation, and I didn't realize I knew you'd written a lot of books. I didn't realize you'd written as many as I think you've written. But you do many things, don't you? I mean, you're a writer, you trained as a zoologist. In my eyes, you're an activist. You're a creative activist, I would call you. You're an educator. You do a lot of work with schools. You've been in TV and radio and media. I mean, you've packed it in, right?
I don't know. I think just spent, there's a, for anybody who's a mum, there is a good quantity of years when mostly what you're doing is keeping on top of the biology experiments at the back of the fridge and ironing school shirts in front of crap television on a Sunday night. So I did that quite a lot, as well as all the other things. And of course, it's a terribly long time since I was doing the Really Wild Show and Superbods and all those things I did for children's television when my kids were really tiny. And my kids are now, in their 30s. So it really does feel like another life.
Because what was that? Was that mid 80s? Was that or?
Yeah, I guess. I think I stopped doing television sort of in the middle of the 90s. It kind of gradually petered out.
Yeah.
And as I started writing, but it took me a good 10 years to kind of get my writing career to a state where I could actually live on it.
Yeah.
And I had a job as a part-time post as a creative writing lecturer. Thank God for creative writing courses, because they do keep writers able to pay their mortgage.
And that was at Bath Spa, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was at Bath Spa, and actually it was lovely, and it taught me a lot about writing and made me some really good friendships, and also lovely to see my students now, people who were my students, being very successful, and some of them successful in the area of writing stories about nature and wildlife and conservation. Jill Lewis was a student of mine, and now she's a great, fantastic advocate for the natural world, and particularly for fighting what happens on grouse moors and the illegal killing of raptors on grouse moors.
So what was your, I'd love to get a little bit of context, a little bit of your story before we sort of get into now and obviously all the work and the writing you're doing, because there is a very strong, looking through your work, there's obviously a very strong sense of nature connection, but there's a lot of work on sort of environmental injustice and obviously social injustice as well that you tackle a lot in your work. But tell us a little bit about the story into I guess your connection with the natural world and your, because you studied zoology at university, so it's quite something obviously was there for you from a pretty young age. Could you tell us a little bit about the journey into it and how you got to sort of start writing?
Well, I don't really remember it. I mean, there wasn't a time when I wasn't completely captivated and fascinated by the natural world. But I think that's something that many, well, I would say all children have in them. But because I think I was a very solitary child, I engaged with that in a way that perhaps children with siblings or playmates around them might not have done. So the garden, the countryside, my parents lived in lots of different places as I was growing up. That was my companionship, really. So the natural world was my kind of social life, really. And so it became very, very important to me. And, it was just a natural step for me to study zoology when I went to university. And I did fantastic. I was really lucky. I did fantastic field work, working on boats, studying whales of various sorts, humpbacks and sperm whales and blue whales. And the writing came about because when I dropped off the bottom of academia when Mrs. Thatcher cut grants for primary research, and I realised that it wasn't for me. I couldn't stay in it, and I joined the natural history unit and worked in television for a while, and didn't really get on with that well either. So I've been a series of failed careers behind me, really. I just didn't have sharp enough elbows to work in television. And I started writing children's books really almost by accident. And because I had grown up with parents who, particularly my father, absolutely loved words, I would sit on the edge of the bath as a little child and he'd be reciting Keats to me. And I have to say, he was a working class boy, but he was a working class Welsh boy. And the value of language, particularly of poetry in Welsh culture, is, as I'm sure you know, absolutely enormous. And so I grew up with that. So coming to writing actually felt really like coming home, like something I had been doing in my head my whole life. So it felt very, sorry about my emails.
No, it's fine.
So it felt really natural, even though establishing myself professionally in that world was a struggle, as I think it is for many writers. It's just a hard place to get your voice out there in a way that's kind of financially viable.
Yeah. It's funny. I was walking my youngest daughter to school this morning, and I was talking about I was going to chat to you today, and she'd been talking about some of your different books that she's read at school, and I said, "Oh, what would you ask Nicola?" And she said, "Well, I'd like to know when did she know that she wanted to write books for children? Like, what was it?"
Oh, what a great question!
So I thought I'd ask you that.
Well, I've written for adults as well as children, much more, obviously, for children. When did I know? When I started doing it, actually, I started doing it and discovered it as a thing that was right in my heart and felt like it had always been there. And the reason I write for children is, well, lots of reasons, really. It's more creative. It's freer. The people who work in children's writing are nicer than the people who work in grown-up writing, I have to say. But actually, fundamentally, because I'm 8 on the inside. And, obviously I have a lot of friends now who write for children, and all of them will tell you that they are not grown up on the inside. My great friend Julia Green, with whom I worked as a lecturer in Bath Spa, and who has only recently stopped running a fantastic MA in writing for young people, which now has strings of sort of famous alumni. Julia and I have spent a lot of time talking about writing. Julia is 14 on the inside, and I'm 8 on the inside. And she writes for the age group that her heart belongs to, and I write primarily for the age group to which my heart belongs.
Amazing. I mean, you've written, I think it's over 60 books. Is that right?
Do you know somebody? I've been saying blithely over 60, and Simon Fisher, who is part of Family Bookworms Wales, who are wonderful reviewers and advocates as a family of children's literature, very sweetly rewrote my wiki entry the other day. Love him. And he says I've written over 80.
Wow.
I know. Anyway, lots.
Yeah, and you've written about. I mean, I was, again, search bit. I mean, you've written about bats. You've written about dolphins, bears, whales, ponds, trees, sharks, turtles, bears, birds, dogs, monsters, and loads more. Can you just tell us about that a little bit, about your sort of writing flow? Like, I mean, I want to get into the promise, because I'd love you to tell a little bit about how that one.
Very often, when you're researching one book, you'll find the beginning of another. You'll find the thread of another. And sometimes, I mean, you mentioned the pond. The pond actually isn't about ponds. It's about grief.
It's about death, isn't it? It's about losing.
It's about someone in the family, and how a family recover. And I am very, very interested in. I'm fascinated by the biology, and I'm desperate to communicate the delight of learning about the intricacies of the natural world. But I am also very, very interested in human relationships with nature and how fundamental that is to our health and well-being, and how we ignore that at not just at the peril of, our planet, which is there in the background at a terrible looming cloud, but also at the peril of our own emotional well-being and of the very fabric of our humanity. And so actually that book, The Pond, came about because I had written a book about the birth of a disabled child, illustrated by Kathy Fisher, who's now become a very close friend. And Kathy was exploring images of ponds for another book that she was working on. I saw them and began to think about this pond and how you would build it in the back garden. And then that idea of a hole in the back garden became, in my head, an emotional hole, the emotional hole that is left in your life when someone you love has died. And that's how that story was born. And the stories of stories are all intertwined through my life, through things I research, through things I find out, and also my interior emotional life.
So it sounds like quite an emergent process for you when you write, because there's certain things that, like you say, you're coming across, or something that's quite spontaneous almost, that might lead to some form of expression. Because I remember, like, I read about the book. Actually, my daughter told me that as well. The day war came.
The day war came.
Yeah, and that was quite that was a sort of a response, right, to.
Yeah, well, I had been listening to reports about Syria, and basically getting more kind of angry and feeling very powerless. And I had started to write something about the experience of war from the point of view of a child, which felt like kind of a really dodgy thing to do. I mean, what do I know? But my father fought in the Second World War and saw and experienced things from which he never recovered, and talked a little bit about that. So I felt I had a tiny bit of personal connection with that. And then the British government refused entry to those 3,000 child refugees, unaccompanied child refugees, children who had experienced some of the worst trauma that is possible for human beings to experience, and who were utterly alone in the world. And our government said, we won't help you, we don't care about you. And that made me feel physically sick. And so I wrote the text of The Day War Came very, very quickly. And I finished it in the morning. I sent it to, at the time, The Guardian had a specific children's aspect to its website. I sent it to the editor, who I knew a little bit there, and she, bless her heart, put it up on the Guardian website that day. And we had Jackie Morris, my friend, and Petter Horacek, another wonderful illustrator friend, both did pictures of empty chairs to go with that. At the time, it was just a poem. It wasn't a picture book text, really. And then we had an influx of empty chairs. And I realized that my subconscious had come up with this idea of an empty chair, which is incredibly powerful image. And that, long story short, had a small role to play in helping Alf Dubs fight for the cause of unaccompanied child refugees.
And you connected up, didn't you, with Help Refugees?
Yeah, I did in the end. And of course, by that stage, we had Rebecca Cobb's wonderful illustrations, and it was a picture book. And we did two launch events for both the hardback and the paperback to raise funds for Help Refugees. And actually, I then connected with another refugee organisation called Refugee Trauma Initiative, who work directly with the most traumatized refugee families and unaccompanied children. And they sent me some real stories, which I then turned into sort of poem texts. So they would have short pieces of text that they could then use in their communications and their campaigns.
So really emergent process, right? Because it's very spontaneous how you just responded to that issue that was.
Well, some of it is spontaneous. Some of it is a lot more kind of laborious. I've just written. I say just written earlier this year. I finished writing 2 or 3 texts about real zoological stories connected directly with climate change, and those are very much trickier to write because you have to incorporate the actual factual material, but you also have to have a narrative. You have to have a really good, strong narrative on which to hang those facts, and that's just technically hard. And those texts take a long time. They take a really, really long time. And I'm writing something now. The thing I'm in the middle of writing now is actually a young adult novel with very strong environmental themes. And obviously, it's 60,000, 70,000. It's going to be quite long. And that just takes time. And I'm not quick. I'm really not quick. I rewrite, I change, I fiddle about with things. I can spend a whole morning fiddling about the same sentence, which is a bit of a handicap. But, it all takes time.
How do you, because I guess the other thing that sort of comes through a lot of your work is often, at least I would say, sort of this, the imaginal realm. So you opening up the imagination particularly to help people make more of these connections to the natural world, to themselves, to their relationships with the living world. And at the same time, I guess over the years, and as the alarm bells get louder, and the issues are becoming more and more, in our faces, and obviously you're sort of in, I guess you're in this kind of tension quite a lot of the time, aren't you, about the sort of realities of what we're living in, and then how to also help kind of open up this curiosity or this imagination, this connection to this extraordinary world that we're part of. And how do you find that sort of working with the sort of, do you know what I mean? This kind of, yeah.
So it's a really difficult balance. It's a really difficult balance for all of us to maintain forward-moving action, positive thinking in the face of relentless ghastliness. But because I'm trained as a biologist, I can see outside a little bit that tiny slither of time in which I exist, because I know about the time that's come before, biologically speaking, not in terms of human history, but in terms of evolution of life on this planet. And I can also envisage a time after. So I know that nature is resilient and adaptable, and that for all that we have done to our supportive, lovely, beautiful web of life on this planet, we are also of it and part of it, and therefore adaptable and resilient too. So I can't give in to despair. I sometimes feel close to it, but I can't give in to it because of that perception I have of the resilience of biology. Also because I'm 8 on the inside, and 8-year-olds are very hopeful. And also because despair is an indulgence, actually, that we as advocates for our planet, we as the people who try to give everybody else a wake-up call and remind them that however urban you think you are, you're still dependent on the ocean, you're still dependent on the sky, you're still dependent on the land and all the life that surrounds it. I think that despair is actually, it makes me cross now when I hear people say, I was at dinner the other night with some people who were saying, oh, it's all hopeless, it's all, can't do anything about it. It makes me furious because actually it's lazy. It's really easy to say, oh, we're all going to hell in the handcart. I'll just jump on a flight to Marrakesh and have a nice time. Thanks very much. I just think it's nonsense, and we have to fight. And even if we go down, we have to go down fighting.
I'm totally with you. What's your sense? Because you do a lot of work. Obviously you write a lot of your writing is for kids, not exclusively, but you do a lot of work with schools as well in creative writing. What's your sense of where the kids and the schools that you're interacting with? Because I as a parent as well, I'm often, the despair I tend to have is in my own head for them or thinking about
Yeah,
and also more and more to do with, I just feel like they're just so overloaded with just bad news after sort of horrific.
Yeah. I totally agree. I mean, I think there are an awful lot of parents who are parents and teachers in schools and education are also overwhelmed and overwhelmed with despair. And the reaction to that is not to talk about it and not to discuss it and try to shield children from it. Whereas actually what we need a really, really fundamental readjustment, well, of everything, obviously, but certainly of education and what we teach children about the world and how they operate in it. The education system is still tailored to turning out fodder for a capitalist, unsustainable capitalist economic model. And obviously, that's not good for anybody, least of all the children who are going to be on the very pointy end of what will come about in the next 50 to 100 years. They need to be educated and prepared for that, which means they need to be divergent thinkers, they need to be creative thinkers, they need to make use of all the ideas that have come before them in human history, and they need to be able to come up with some bloody good ones for the future. And they need practical skills. I don't really want to say that the most important thing one can teach children now is how to shoot straight. But if we don't get our act together pretty shortly, that will be a really, really good skill to teach your children.
Talking of shooting, there was a book you wrote, which struck me. What was it called? It was called. Was it the Flying Free? Flying Free? Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
The reason it's because you talk about shooting. It's about the boy who gets the air rifle, right? And he shoots
Yeah, he gets given an air rifle and he thinks he wants to be big and tough and shoot things. And he ends up winging a sparrowhawk and is immediately filled with terrible remorse. And then brings that sparrowhawk back from injury to being a free-flying bird, and through that discovers things about himself and strengths in himself he didn't realize he had.
I really connect with. I haven't read the book, but when I read the thing, because I had an experience like that as a young boy. I
Really? Wow.
I was probably 11, maybe, and I had an air rifle. I used to live out in the middle of nowhere, and a friend of mine at school, he had one as well, and we were using it to shoot cans and bottles and God knows what else. But then, of course, you move to seeing wildlife, and I remember shooting this pigeon, and I can remember pulling the trigger, and I can remember the pigeon being, it was probably, I don't know, 60, 70 meters away in this tree. And I remember the thud, and I remember this thing spinning out of the tree, and I remember feeling utterly mortified, and just it was so visceral. I can still feel it. That feeling of, what have I done? I've taken some life, which I thought was. It was almost like you, when you do it, you're not even sure that you're gonna hit this thing and what's gonna happen. And I did the same thing a month later with a rabbit. This was a guy I used to go to school with who was really into shooting. He was really into sort of you've got to kill things. And this rabbit it squeaked, the sound it made when we shot it, and I burst into tears. And I can remember that. We did actually take the rabbit to the butcher, and he did give us a couple of quid. I'm not that sure that made it any better, but I never did it again. But it was a real moment of connection. It sounds weird, but through
no, absolutely. I totally get that. And in a way, that kind of it's kind of a metaphor for our whole modern relationship with the natural world. Is that we are constantly shooting bullets at the natural world, but we are so removed from their impact that we don't have that visceral response. And of course, if we did have that connection, that visceral response, if we actually saw right in front of us now what the consequences of our actions were, things would be very different. And also we have in the West, we have a whole cultural context that has removed us from a sense of being part of nature. And it's actually what I'm writing about in this novel now, this process of
separation.
removal.
Yeah.
And actually, perhaps the most important thing that we as a species, well, our section of the species, because of course there are plenty of indigenous people around the world who already know that they are part of the natural world. That's the lesson we need to relearn.
Yeah.
And I think it's an attitudinal shift that really needs to come about. I mean, I sometimes feel bad that I don't do more active campaigning. I have a daughter who's a very, very, very active campaigner and has done some wonderful things with Extinction Rebellion. And I don't do that kind of active campaigning anymore. But I kind of feel my skill set is to help reconnect, is to help this attitudinal shift. And we all do what we can. And I console myself with a motto that was on the wall of our downstairs loo when I was a kid growing up. And it used to irritate me enormously as a child and adolescent, but I remember it now very clearly. And it said, "Little drops of water, little grains of sand make the mighty ocean and the promised land." And we all have to just try and do our little bit. And if everybody does their little bit, then
and
we are
what you're talking about is very interesting to me, because I've been exploring sort of different types of activism for quite a few years, and in this creative activism, again, to your point, like there are many forms. For some of us it's direct action, putting ourselves out into the world, protesting, but there are so many ways to be active on behalf of life, right? So and I think what you're speaking to at the moment is it's a big area of my inquiry in sort of creative culture, is trying to again find ways to encourage more people with creative influence to start to explore these things more intentionally through their work, because it's almost like many times it's like we put our creativity out into the world, and people do what they want to do, but it's this whole there's no creativity on a dead planet, right? It's like we're in this point now where it feels like there's a responsibility for more, just to help people more understand what's going on, but also to see that there are new possibilities, right, and new ways of seeing the world. And I think this is such an interesting space, because I think it's, as more and more of the constructed world starts to unravel, I think, these edges maybe that many of us have been exploring are starting, maybe they're opening up. More people are starting to look towards these.
Yeah, I think that's true. As you said, it's a very good word to use, unravel. As the world that we know and we think is the only world unravels, then other possibilities open up. I wrote a book called Gaia Warriors in 2009 about climate change and about ways of being involved in the solution rather than being part of the problem. And one of the people I interviewed for it was a fantastic guy called Mark Maslin, who is Professor of Environmental Change at UCL. And actually, Mark, bless him, kept my sanity when I was writing that book, because he was the first person to say to me, okay, well, what is our low carbon future going to look like? It's going to look rather nice. It's going to look like this and like this and like this. And he said the problem with climate change activism is all they say is, we're all going to die.
Yeah.
Nobody says, hey, look what it could be. Nice. And that's why in my introduction to the film of The Promise, I said the first step is imagining what you want it to be like. And that is a really, really powerful step. And that is where creativity, imagination, storytelling have a real, have some traction, actually, have real impact in the real world, is encouraging people to imagine. Because, of course, all the systems that we are laboring under now do not want you to imagine anything different. Of course, they want to say you can't change because it's in their interests. Well, they think it's in their interest. Of course, it's in nobody's interest, but they think it is in their interests to keep the status quo, to not imagine anything different. And of course, that's the profoundest self-oppression that there can be, is to think that you can't even imagine something different.
And so let's talk about The Promise, because it was it 2014 you wrote The Promise?
No, I wrote it. I actually wrote it in 2010. And then it took Laura a terribly long time to do the illustration. And then it was published in 2013.
Right. And when you...
So I wrote it just after I had finished, pretty much very soon after I had finished writing Gaia Warriors, which was about climate change. And so all that stuff was very kind of freshly in my head. And I was asked to write a picture book version of a book called The Man Who Planted Trees, that many people will know, written by Jean Genot in the 30s, 40s, I can't remember. Very, very powerful story, written as in a reportage style, a novella that had enormous impact when it was published. But I didn't want to steal somebody else's story. Also, I wanted a child to be at the heart of the story, and I wanted it to be an urban child, and I wanted it to be about urban transformation, because, of course, that's where most people are going to be living. There's a massive, massive move amongst humanity from rural agricultural situations to urban situations. There have been since the Industrial Revolution, and that's now accelerating even more into super cities, particularly in the developing world. And I had some experience of being in cities in the developing world and how very ungreen and unpleasant they can be. And of course, cities in the West too, ungreen and unpleasant. And I wanted to write about that. And that's how that story came about. And it came, I thought about it for a long time in a very kind of diffuse sort of a way. And then I just sat down one morning and it came down my arm onto the page. And in 2 hours, I had what I knew was a finished text. And I knew that it was a really powerful story. And I've seen it working in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of contexts. It speaks very powerfully to children who are in very bad situations. And I've seen that happening. I'll just tell you one briefly. I was in a school in Boston, what they call a public school over there, state school in Boston. And a child came into my session late with 3 minders. And the other children in the class didn't react at all. It was clearly very normal that this kid had 3 adult minders. And he crawled around on the floor. And he made his way to sit. I was sitting down and he leant against my shins as I was reading the promise. And I had long hair at the time. And at the end of the story, he got hold of the end of my hair, very gently tugged me down so that my face was next to his. And he whispered, "That story is about me." And I thought, "Love you, my darling." It is. And that's kind of, I wrote that story very much for children in bad situations, to say, there's a bigger world. You won't always be a powerless child. You can have some power in that bigger world. It may not look like the sort of power that other human beings call power, but you can have it and you can take it and you can make a very, very positive effect on the world around you through engaging with the natural world rather than solely engaging with the human one.
And it's such a, when you read the book now, and obviously now with the, the animation from Chi, but it feels so now in terms of the context, doesn't it? It's like,
well, hopefully, I do know. I know the story works. I know it's a silver bullet, actually. And that sounds an arrogant thing to say, but I don't, I'm too old now not to say what I feel and what I know. I know that story came down my arm. I was given that story by something. And I know that it works. And I know that if we can just get it in front of enough people, it will, as I said in my introduction, be a seed of change.
So what's it like seeing the book now with the animation? What's it like now? 2020.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
it's absolutely amazing. But I had looked at the animation so much by the time it went live last Friday, a week ago today. I kind of had stopped being able to really see it, and I was really anxious about it. I saw the schools had signed up for it, and I'd lost the ability to really see the power of it. And so it was fantastic to see the amazing responses that people had to it. And to see, whole schools full of little kids planting acorns and, really engaging practically with the environmental message that they had been presented with. And of course, now it's our job now to try and make space for that planting in the real world, so that all those little acorns that have been planted in pots end up having a real home, which of course means we start to move into a much less comfortable for some people area, because of course little kids planting acorns is lovely. Little kids saying, "Okay, City Council, where are you going to create some green space for us to plant these acorns?" It's a very different matter. So it's going to be jolly interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because I wrote a little bit about this at the start. Well, actually, just a few months into lockdown, just about like how, if you were going to come out of this, all that's been revealed, all the inequality that we know has existed, it's been out there, but it's suddenly it's been revealed to a huge amount more people have seen, what really sits underneath normal, and the sort of suffering that people are experiencing day by day. And the idea of, cities or urban spaces, places where people are living in huge numbers, where there is no natural environment. It's been stripped out, developed over, concreted over, car parked, whatever it is, right, turn into shops. It sort of strikes me that, again, in these times we're now moving into, one of the best things that could be done is to create really nature rich environments for people. Because if you're going to have even more economic issues and even more insecurity with work and at least make the spaces we're living in beautiful. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
because surely that's going to sort of soften or hold people a little bit in terms, but it's almost like it doesn't compute with the powers. And then the cynic in me tends to think, actually, is this just intentional? The more you strip this stuff away, the more it drives people to feel like, they're worthless, and, the more they're engaged in consumerism,
absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't think that's cynical. I think that's, I mean, it's a question of whether you believe in cock up or conspiracy, really. And some days I'm all for the cock up, and some days I'm for the conspiracy. And at the moment, with what's going on in the UK, particularly at the minute, yep, I'm down with the conspiracy. I think, it's entirely intentional to undermine people's sense of well-being and their sense of power. It works brilliantly for those who want to hold on to power, who want to hold on to wealth, to make the rest of us feel like we don't matter, we're rubbish, and we can't do anything about anything.
Yeah. No, I think that's right, and that's why I said that there's this sort of vision. Even this idea of thousands of children sort of looking for land to to get their forests growing next year would be a beautiful thing.
And not just looking and hoping, but actually quietly and powerfully demanding.
You're right, yeah.
And I think there are some very interesting partnerships coming about between the film and organisations that are ready to help facilitate that.
Yeah.
We've got the Scottish launch coming up next week with a wonderful Lost Woods project and Alexandra Mackenzie, off whom one could run the national grid. Honestly, she's an amazing woman. And there's increasing connection and synergy between the Lost Words and the Promise. I mean, Jackie and I are good mates and have been good mates for many years. But the impact that the Lost Words had on empowering people to speak up about the loss of nature and how important that is. And now, with the Promise and its implication of land access and land equality and nature equality, that's a powerful creative mix, a powerful creative process with the ability to have an impact in the real world on real lives.
It's incredible, though, isn't it? The role that the youngsters are sort of finding themselves playing. I was watching this morning on something like I can't remember what it was on some feed, but this European common agricultural policy thing that's being done at the moment, which again is just seems like a high level, is just going to be about vast subsidies given again to sort of the most kind of industrial intensive farmers across the EU with no real stringent kind of environmental asks within those new policies. And again, you've got all these mainly girls I see as well, but teenagers, Greta and all, various others around Europe, campaigning today to the European Parliament. And there's a bit of it where you just go, it's just madness, it's sort of like, this is just the sense and the sort of wisdom that's coming from the young. It sort of goes back to the indigenous piece. When would any indigenous culture ever, where the young ringing the bells for the elders? It's just weird, isn't it? It's sort of, I don't know, we've lost our way so much, I think, with what you were speaking to earlier about this. this understanding more our place, our connection. And I was reading recently, I can't remember, maybe this is across many indigenous cultures, but their relationship, I was reading about how for many, the trees and plants are the elders. They're the ones that are
Yes.
seen as having more wisdom than the human because they were here before us. They've been here longer.
There was a fantastic, I very occasionally managed to catch Ian Macmillan's program on Radio 3, and he had 2 or 3 North American indigenous poets on his program, and one of them was talking about her language, which I'm ashamed to say I can't remember the name of. But in her language, it is impossible to talk about I or me without linguistically including the landscape. Now, I can't even imagine what that sounds like, what that is like. But I can grasp that if that is the very linguistic structure in which you are raised and through which you articulate your thoughts to others and to yourself, your whole perception of yourself as a living thing is completely different from our perception of ourselves in our culture. And I think exploring those cultural and linguistic areas that are unfamiliar to us it is potentially powerful, interesting, and a real catalyst for change.
Yeah, it's reminding me of that is it Orrin Fox's quote of he says to the sort of Western people, you're to you people, you call nature your resources. To us, we call it our relatives. And it's just this
Absolutely.
shift, isn't it? And that's the thing. What always strikes me, again, going back to sort of all of these these the complexity of these big issues, but actually it's a shift as a way of seeing and thinking and being that's kind of required, isn't it? It's a sort of just there's something could be sort of enormously transformational with just a shift, just a shift of how we see ourselves in the world. I know that's big. That's a big shift as well, but it's actually quite simple as well.
It is, and something for which our very nature, the very fabric of ourselves as living things, is really ready to receive. A kind of rightness about it, even though it is unfamiliar. That speaks to the core of what we are. I just this year had a book published called Grow, which is essentially about DNA, and that's the language that all life is written in. All life is written in DNA. So in every cell of our bodies, we have an encoded language that connects us right back through the billions of years of the history of our planet to the very, very, very first and simplest living things. We share that with everything that's alive. And that means something. That matters. And that matters and means in a way that can't be expressed in words because it's so fundamental. It's something that we feel and know. And that maybe is reflected in languages of indigenous people, but isn't reflected in current modern languages that are used by people in this modern technological world.
Yeah, it's so fascinating, and because I guess there's a part of this where you think that where will these cultural shifts come from, and obviously there's a sense if that understanding of being part of something bigger, at least in my experience with kids as well, feels like it's, you know, it's there. They understand that from a very, you know, almost immediate, you know, it's
absolutely.
they
Know
they
it.
know
They
it.
know it.
But then it's obviously, you know, it's kind of stripped out of us mainly through how we're taught, educated,
Yes.
you know, to look at the world and to think about our place in it. But I'm worried, and I'm curious. One of the things I'm quite curious about, and again, is, you know, people in power, and as more of, you know, as we're facing more and more of these issues, what is, you know, it's there. You know, it must be still there in all of us, but it's, you know, it's been hidden, or you know, yeah. I'm just curious of how we might see these. You know, can we imagine seeing these kind of awakenings in people in power? Are they able to sort of shift their way? Because we're moving, like you said, some of the, you know, the writing you're looking at more and more is exploring that interconnection, and this great separation that's occurred over the, you know, predominantly over the last few hundred years, particularly, that we're somehow separate, you know, from the natural world, and we're in control of it, and, you know, it's actually, it's dangerous. You know, we have to fear it as well. And
Yeah, but I think there's a couple of things to say about that. The first is that I think for the people who are most in power, for the people who are most embedded in this dysfunctional, wrong-headed system, which we have all been caught up with for the last couple of 100 years, maybe a little bit longer than that. I think to expect them to change, they're too damaged. They're just too damaged. They're not going to change. So we need to change, and then we need to replace them. So that's the first thing to say about that. The other thing to say is, yeah, you know, I think that's probably the best strategy. Anyway, the other thing I wanted to say was that you were saying about where will these awareness changes come from? And the one thing that human beings, well, we're bad at many things, but one thing that we're absolutely supremely bad at is predicting our own futures. We are really, really rubbish at it. You know, I don't know if you're probably not old enough to remember this, but when I was a kid, by the year 2000, people really, really did think that we were all going to be in space, dressed in tinfoil, eating tablets instead of meals.
Yeah, my brother used to read 2000 AD comic. I was born in the 70s, so and I remember, you know, that just seemed like, you know, it was all about, yeah, we were in spaceships, really, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, we just really, really rubbish, and that actually, on the one hand, is completely terrifying, but on the other, is very hopeful. I mean, you think of how things 15 years ago. Nobody would have known what you meant if you prefixed any word with the word eco. They just wouldn't have known. And it's everywhere now.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, there was a thing on the radio this morning, a long report about biodiversity. And that's a word. I think if you look at the incidence of, you know, the same way that Jackie and Rob looked at the incidence of all these words that have been taken out of the Children's English Dictionary. Yeah. If you look at the incidence of the word biodiversity, 10 years ago, only biologists knew what that word was. And now it's gradually popping up. The awareness that we are supported by this web of life, and if we start chopping it to bits, we fall through, the penny is beginning to drop. Now, it may drop too late. That's true. But it is dropping. It is changing. We do have the capacity to change, which goes back to what I was saying about, you know, part of change is that you can't imagine what it's going to be. You have to try and imagine what it's going to be. You have to try and go for it. And everything around you is saying, no, nothing can change. We all have to stay the same. But actually, that's not true. Change is absolutely what life is.
Yeah, it's happening all the time, right? I mean,
It's happening all the time. You know, when you're a biologist, you learn what the characteristics of life are. And one of the characteristics of life is growth and change. So actually, if you're not changing and growing in different directions and looking different and being different and behaving different, you're dead. So actually, change is something that we should absolutely embrace as being part of being truly alive.
I think what is really interesting when you talk about it, because one of the things, again, and I think it's connected to this story of separation, how we see ourselves separate. But it's even, I mean, I'm no biologist, so I'm probably going to make some stuff up here, and you're going to go, "That's not true." But there's a couple of things. One is the sort of microbiology of the human, right? Which is that we have so many we're less human cells, aren't we, than non-human or something?
Yeah, we're fewer human cells than bacterial.
Yeah. And so, all of that things that we are effectively a living, we are alive. We've got inside us, millions of relationships going on and systems and I think there's something for me about this, you always hear, because we've sort of, again, this separation piece where we've, it's manifested through people kind of, worrying constantly about dirt or, or like spraying like sort of, chemicals everywhere to sort of protect themselves. There's this kind of weird, we've got to this really weird place where actually, we're living things, right? We're made up of, there are viruses all around us. Most of them we have no problem with them, right? It's kind of, I don't know, there's something about this kind of story of separation that's got us into some really weird spaces where we've almost forgotten that we are a living thing made up of. And I wonder how much of that, how much, how we might start to explore that more culturally, because I think, I don't know, it just feels like that's part of the problem as well, where we've removed ourselves from life.
I think that is being culturally explored, actually. I think there are more and more people thinking about representing that in all sorts of different art forms. And I'm continually delighted to see artists of all sorts talking about those things in their work, talking about things that, as I say, would only have been the field of trained biologists 20 years ago, and they're now coming into the sphere of so many different sorts of people, and with all sorts of different trainings and different backgrounds and different perspectives. And I think that's another really, really hopeful, really, really hopeful sign.
Yes, absolutely. Getting bringing the bio back into our culture. The aliveness of everything. I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's and
actually, what a total delight that is. That one of the things that I have always said when I'm talking to audiences, that the reason I want people to be interested in natural world, there are lots of reasons, but actually the most emotionally fundamental one is that it's pleasurable. It's hugely pleasurable to be able to notice the details of nature. Means that almost everywhere you go, there will be something to look at, to wonder at, to take pleasure in, and also to take comfort in. If you're looking at the natural world, you are always turned outwards. So you are turned outwards from your inner darkness. And who goes through life without being tortured by inner darkness sometimes, without being living under the threat of being completely engulfed by that inner darkness. But if you are interested in the natural world, if you learn to look, you're turned outwards to the light. eternally. And that is such a great skill, a great trick to learn and to absorb and to take with you throughout your life, because it means there will always be that.
Yeah.
There will always everywhere be that comfort available to you if you just look.
It is it's beautiful, and it's challenging to the industrial growth machine, though, isn't it? Because the more, at least my own experiences, the more awake you are to your connection to life and your relationships to the living world, the more you are able to cope with the darkness and the complexities that life throws at you, and the more you're conscious of, or I think you become more conscious of this constructed world and actually what it's doing. You know what I mean? And maybe your needs, your desires for immersing yourself, that become, they're lessened. You can start to you basically suss it out, right? You become more aware of how the thing works.
You suss it out that actually things and stuff are not what it's about. And that is the most subversive thing. For the Donald Trumps of this world, people who suss out that things and stuff don't matter are terrifyingly subversive. Because if everybody gets that, and actually increasingly people are getting that, then they're stuffed. Then their whole edifice of trade and economics and economic models and hedge funds, all of that is just so much nonsense.
Well, then we go back to the word eco, right? And in economics, good management of the household,
Yes,
that's weird.
Good and sustainable management of our planetary household,
right,
which is something that indigenous cultures absolutely knew, and they knew it not in a kind of airy fairy hippie kind of a way. They knew it because if they didn't get that message, they were dead.
Yeah, right.
And actually, that is where we are now. On the big scale, if we don't relearn the messages that those indigenous cultures had impressed on them by the exigencies of nature, we'll be dead.
And it strikes me again as the sort of
I did quite a lot of research into Inuit.
I saw that one of your
culture
books.
And lifestyle for several books, and Inuit. You can romanticize it. Very, very wonderful culture, fantastic natural material-based technology, extraordinarily inventive, tied to that very, very harsh and unforgiving environment by an absolute rope of necessity. You had to know what you were doing. You could not overstep the mark in that environment or you'd be dead. It was very, very tough, but it created people with enormous spiritual, emotional, intellectual resources who were very resilient. But when that rope of necessity was cut, they're stuffed. And now in Inuit communities across the Arctic, there is an absolute epidemic of mental illness. In Canadian Inuit communities, the suicide rate amongst under 20s is 57 times the national average. And that's because their whole culture depended on that rope of necessity that tied them to nature. And when that was cut, everything fell apart.
That was like the destruction of the buffalo, right? In the
absolutely.
Same story.
And we think
you take out the part of the culture.
yeah, we think we've cut that rope of necessity between us and the natural world. And absolutely, we've just stretched it and stretched it and stretched it and stretched it. But it's there, and it will ping us back with a terrible shock unless we begin to perceive that connection and pay attention to it.
Yeah, I think the more again, personally, the more I've sort of explored, some of those stories that you're speaking to, and some of those realities that, again, we're not. It's not common knowledge. They're not part of the inverted commas histories that we're taught. But the more you understand, like, I was looking at, the thousands of years that those cultures have lived and created extraordinary, intelligent operating systems, from food and health and agriculture, all kinds of, but completely in harmony. And you think what damage we've done in a few hundred years. And again, that story of seeing that, that story that we've sort of flattened was primitive and tragic and, not, and again, you start to see, I think this is this really interesting piece about, that story of the eagle and the condor, that, that actually this prediction of, the eagle was the bird that represented the sort of the masculine kind of spirit and mechanistic and science driven and very rational, logical, whereas the condor represented the people of the South, the feminine, the intuitive, and this story that was told a few hundred years ago that the people of the North, represented by the eagle, would come and dominate the world, and the people of the South and the condor would almost come to a point of extinction, and then something, the world would be at this point of collapse, I guess, and the two cultures came together. So the sort of the Western rational scientific mind with the intuitive, more feminine spirit, connected with the more than human world, and actually it's in that combination that we might find this new possibility. And I love that. I love that because, again, we're living in this kind of divisive culture and polarized, and actually we need all of these kind of ways of being and thinking, right? Or we need to sort of hold them all, really, and work with them.
Hold them all, put them into combinations, and come up with some new stories.
Yes. Amazing. I just wanted to talk about poo to finish off with.
Good subject.
just because it's such a great subject, and you've written a book about it, and I just, it's brilliant, and everyone loves. It's just, it's a key thing. Can we talk about poo for a bit? Is that right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I always have to talk about poo. It's kind of where my zoological career started. The very first job I had before I went to university, I was an intern for what was then the Wildfowl Trust, is now the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust.
Oh yeah, I know them.
And I was helping with the study of geese. And my first job was collecting goose poo on a Scottish salt marsh.
As you do.
And we used to, as you do, to look at energy flow through the whole salt marsh ecosystem, and particularly through the barnacle geese that were living there. Poo is a fantastic tool for finding out about things. I studied bats. I did a PhD, which I'm ashamed to say I never finished, and I studied bat feeding ecology, and I collected bat poo and spent 2 years of my life looking down a binocular microscope at insect parts in bat poo. And it was fascinating. Studying whales, sperm whales are down there in the darkness you can't actually see exactly what species of squid they're taking, but they poo out the beaks when they're at the surface, and you can scoop them up and analyze them and see exactly what it is that's feeding them down there in the dark where you can't find them. Poo is a really, really fantastic tool for looking at animal behavior, for looking at animal distribution, for looking at territories, you can look at the DNA in poo and look at relationships between animals. It's a great biological tool. And I wrote that book really as a way of saying to children, these are the different ways that you can study animals. You can be a detective. And poo is one of the clues that you can use to unravel all these fantastic stories from the natural world.
Why did my dog? I've got a pointer, and she loves to eat cow poo, like anything, when you're out, and she clearly really wants it. What's going on there?
I don't know if wolves do it, but I expect they do. I think there are two things. I think, first of all, there may be nutrients in there that carnivore guts don't have access to, and that they get from the herbivore gut, which of course has a very different bacterial flora. I think that's one thing. And the other thing is, if you eat and roll in the poo of animals that you are then going to try and catch, you smell like them. So when you're hunting them and you make a mistake of being the wrong end of the wind from them, and your smell is carried on the wind, you're slightly more likely to get round their detection systems and to be successful in your hunt.
Interesting.
But the other thing, of course, that dogs do is that they read each other's poo.
Yes.
That's a piece of dog poo for a dog.
There's a lot of intel. There's a lot of
board.
intel in there, isn't there?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, and the other thing about smell, which is really interesting and really unique amongst senses, because all other senses are giving you immediate information about what is happening now. But poo tells you what happened several hours ago or even weeks ago. So it's giving you a timeline.
It's investigative.
With that information.
Brilliant. I love that. Actually, it's funny as you talk about this as well. I just saw something this morning about, I can't remember what I saw it, but they were saying that some scientists have been looking at testing sewage for COVID.
Oh, yes, for COVID. Yeah. Great idea. But did you hear the other thing? And I suspect this isn't being well funded because nobody's going to make any money out of it. But the most, probably the cheapest way to do testing is with dogs. So dogs have been used for a long time, trained dogs have been used for a long time in the diagnosis of certain cancers because people smell different. And there is a great body of scientific evidence to show that this is very accurate. And the scientists involved in this particular piece of research have discovered that COVID has a smell and that dogs can detect it. A single dog can monitor 250 people in an hour and essentially test them for the presence of COVID.
Amazing. That's where
and where has the 12 billion that this government has spent on track and trace gone?
How many dogs could you have trained for that?
You could train a lot of dogs for that.
Could have a dog in every household.
Yeah, you could. Well, I suspect the dog research, which is going on at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, or Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, I never remember which way around it is. A chap called Professor Logan is doing it. And I suspect that research is not being publicised or funded because no big chemical company is going to get a backhander from that.
Yeah. Well, there we have it. So, listen, what's coming up? I mean, you know, what should? I mean, obviously, we're going to link out to all the Promise work, and I'll link out to your sites. People can, you know, people haven't yet come across your work. Although I can't believe that people haven't come across your work because you're so prolific. But what else is coming up, or was there anything you'd like to share that that people could look out for or connect with?
Well, I've had quite a few things out this year, and because of COVID, they haven't really had as much attention as they normally would have done. So I've got this book, Grow, which is about DNA for little kids. I've got another one which is about migration, about the South American diaspora to North America, but actually all of that framed within the story of an injured albatross and a boy who finds the albatross at sea. And I've got my very first self-illustrated book, Last, which is the story of a white rhino, based on the real story of the last northern white rhino. And I've got a story about bullying, illustrated by lovely, lovely Kathy Fisher, who I mentioned earlier, about a little Japanese girl who starts in a new school and is bullied and gets round the bullying in a really, really fantastic, beautiful, creative way. So there's lots of things that have come out this year, but the thing that I'm working on now is the longest novel that I've worked on in a decade, I think. And hopefully it's going to address all of the things that we've talked about today in terms of Indigenous sensibility and sustainability, and how that awareness needs to be the new awareness that we all have to take us forward into a more hopeful future.
Amazing. I mean, just thank you for everything you do. Your work's extraordinary, and your energy and what you're putting out into the world is just, it's incredible. And it's been a real treat to, just to do a little bit of collaboration around the launch of the film. It's great. Thank you for having the time, taking the time out of your schedule.
No, it's lovely. I've had a nice little holiday this afternoon. Talking on.
So I always close this. Well, this is the inspiration for this show, the Spaceship Earth, with this idea of becoming crew on the Spaceship Earth. What does that mean for you right now?
Wow. It means telling stories, really. Sharing stories about ourselves, and sharing stories about the other lives on our planet. Human beings have been very, very we're good at talking about ourselves. As I have just demonstrated over the last hour, I'm very good at talking about myself. But actually, we need to be better at telling stories about the other lives with which we share our planet, because we are crew. We are the crew. We are the ones who are currently trying to steer and drive. But actually, we need to really, really pay attention to the stories of the other organisms that are down in the engine room and in the passenger seats, and tell their stories too.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
You're incredibly welcome, my dear. Thank you.
And yes, well, we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
So I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Nicola Davies, and I certainly did. Do check Nicola's work out. Do check out The Promise, the animation. I'll drop that in the show notes. You can find it on the BBC. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it all over the place, but I'll drop it in. It's short. It's like 7 minutes.
well worth watching. It's so of this moment. It's ridiculous. But yes, and thanks for listening. I do appreciate it. If you like what you've heard, if you like the show, give us a rating if you can on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you listen to. It'll take a few seconds and it will help more people find the show, which is always nice to get more listeners. Or share it with anyone you think might like it. If you've got anything that's come up for you during this, do reach out. You can get me on dan@thespaceship.earth, drop me a mail, or we're on Instagram at thespaceship.earth. It's always lovely to get any feedback or thoughts on the show. So on that, look after yourselves, and thanks again for listening. Until next time, peace and out.